Welcome, everybody. Some people may be showing up a little bit past start time, but to get us kicked off, I'd like to welcome Matt Hunerfoth. Matt is teaching in the HCI program at RIT, and today he's going to share research about evaluating ASL technologies.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. So the focus of the talk today is really to kind of convey some methodological ideas of how you could conduct studies if you're going to have participation of people with disabilities in the study or people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And so I'll kind of show you an example of an experiment that we've done at the lab, but I'm not going to present it in the way that I would normally present it like at a research conference. Instead, the goal is to show you a little bit more of a behind-the-scenes idea of what we had to think about in order to conduct the study correctly. But I'll first give some introduction about what I do. So my research is at this intersection of three areas of computer science. So it is within HCI, but it also uses a lot of technologies from the field of computational linguistics. So in particular, that's a field that studies how to process human languages or to generate human language. It also intersects with the field of computer accessibility and assistive technology. Now this is a pretty broad field. So the field of accessibility focuses on technologies for people with a wide variety of abilities. They may have vision, motor, or hearing impairments. It might include cognitive limitations, low literacy. So that's a pretty broad spread of work. So what do people actually talk about together when they get together at a conference in this area? Well, you can think of it as a bit of a sandwich, okay? So early on in the process, you've got to understand what these users might actually want from technology, okay? So there's a lot of methodology from the field of HCI in order to do that well. In the middle of the sandwich, this is where things get pretty diverse. You might use technology from computational linguistics. You might use more traditional techniques from HCI in some way to come up with a new solution to that challenge. And then at the end of the sandwich, you've got the evaluation stage. So how do you actually know that the technology was understandable to people? So there's a lot of commonalities there in terms of good study design to encourage participation of people with disabilities to evaluate things. So the design cycle, of course, comes up quite a lot in this. We'll see again how this connects. So I'm going to talk about some work today. It's not stuff that I did by myself. So this is joint work with a lot of students at my laboratory. Many of them are listed here, and a lot of alumni from previous years. So my lab is called the Linguistic and Assistive Technologies Lab. It's around the corner on this floor. And here are the smiling faces of the researchers at my lab. So we particularly focus on using computational linguistics in a way that has benefits for people with disabilities. It's also part of a bigger research center at RIT with other faculty members at RIT, Vicki Hansen and Stephanie Liddy, and other research students. So this field of accessibility, what are some of the other institutions that are out there in the field? Well, there's special interest groups. So the Association for Computing Machinery has a special interest group on computers and accessibility. Their big activity is that they run a research conference in this field. So this is the ASSETS conference that came to Rochester last October. My work in computational linguistics, we also interact with a special interest group in that professional organization that focuses on those technologies applied to assistive technology applications. And there's journals in this field as well. Okay, so as a case study for what we're going to focus on today, which is how do you conduct studies well with people with disabilities, we're going to talk about an experiment that we did at my lab. But first, I want to just kind of explain what was the actual technology we were testing and why were we building it. So this work was focused on American Sign Language animations. So why would anyone actually build this? Well, a lot of people in the world use American Sign Language. So some estimates have about 500,000 users of the language. And it's different than just English. So it's not just English words that you do on your hands. It's a different language with a different word order. So this means that it's as hard to learn ASL as any other foreign language. And you could be skilled in ASL but have difficulty in English. And in fact, if we look at some standardized test scores for English literacy scores for people who are deaf and hard of hearing, we see that they actually have lower levels of English literacy than hearing counterparts. So what this means is you might have a website out there that has English text on it. There might be no sound on the website, but there could still be an accessibility challenge for someone who's deaf or hard of hearing because the complexity of the text might be too high. So there's a value in being able to put information out there in the form of American Sign Language. Now there's no written form for this language, so you've got to put it out there dynamically. So you're talking about videos or maybe animations. So videos seem like the simple solution. You could just video record somebody, put it on your website, which would be great if information on websites never changed. But it tends to change. And the problem with a video is you've got to get somebody to come back in and be re-recorded performing the message all over again. And this becomes a huge burden for an organization to keep their website information up to date. There would be a natural tendency here to maybe update the English version of the material on the site and maybe leave the ASL material get a little bit out of date, which is not a great solution. Also, let's say you wanted to generate a page dynamically in response to a query, so maybe a search result. You can't anticipate exactly what the person's going to be searching for, so you can't really pre-record the message exactly. And there's other applications too, where it might be nice to have a way to create an ASL message just when you need it. So just to kind of illustrate why it's a bit tricky and challenging to actually create sign language animations, I'm going to show you a little bit about ASL linguistics. So I'll just show you an example sentence, and I'll just talk to you about kind of what this sentence illustrates. All right. So the sentence I'll talk about here is, today I'm visiting Sig Kai. Okay. Now, in ASL, it would have a slightly different word order. So the topic that you're going to talk about. So let's say I was going to say more about Sig Kai later. You would tend to express that at the beginning of the sentence. And so it moves to the front of the sentence, and you raise your eyebrows a little bit when you say it. In addition, if there's something you think you're going to talk about more, you actually point to a location around your body in space, and you set up that location as representing that person, place, or thing that you're going to talk about. So in this case, we have Sig Kai. I would just fingerspell it, so S-I-G-C-H-I, and then I would point to some location in space. Okay? In this case, I've got a little subscript X there to represent the location. Next, time information would be expressed also early in a sentence in ASL. So you'd say today. And there's a special facial expression you do when you're establishing a time phrase early in an ASL sentence. So it involves head tilting a little bit of eyebrow movement. Then you actually say, I visit. So you point to yourself, I, and then you say the verb visit. Now, if you look up visit in the dictionary, you'll see something that looks like this, with the hands moving away from the body, maybe toward the camera or the person you're talking to. But actually, when you use visit in a sentence, it always is different because it aims its directional path at the location that you're visiting. So if I set up Sig Kai in space at some point over here, visit becomes something that looks like this. So this is why the notation here has a little subscript X, to show that that word is affected by space. I also aim my eye gaze, so if you have a verb that takes direct object in American Sign Language, you'd use eye gaze to aim at the location of the object. So all together, it looks something like, okay. So we see from this example, there's reference points set up in space, signs change how they're performed based on this, and also that facial expressions and other things aside from your hands are important to the meaning. Facial expressions can get more complicated than this. So the study I'm going to show you today will talk about some animations we did that focused on facial expression a little bit. Oh, he's already starting to move a little bit. They'll repeat. So in this case, we're seeing some examples of facial expressions that you would perform during a whole phrase or a whole sentence, and it can change the meaning. So for example, if you perform a yes-no facial expression during a sentence, a statement gets turned into a question. So if you miss that, or if your animation isn't clear about it, the meaning's quite different. Negation is another one that would have a dramatic effect. So meaning of a sentence would change to its opposite if you're performing this facial expression. If you've got a sentence that has a WH question, like who, what, where, when, there's a special facial expression that must occur for that as well. That topic, so like the sig chi that I set up in our example sentence, has a particular facial expression movement. He's got his eyeballs a little bit bugged in this one more than I think might be necessary in this example. Okay. There's another facial expression for rhetorical questions, and I mentioned there was a time one also, so there's quite a few of these in ASL. There's a couple ways that you can make a sign language animation. So I'm going to show you some of the ways we don't do it first. There's a terribly slow way that you could make an ASL animation. So you could do the same thing that a movie studio would do. You could control every joint of the body at every moment in time, and you get something that's very beautiful and very fluid, but it takes a very long time to build. Okay, so there may be a 100-to-1 ratio in terms of effort to the final animation. It could even be more extreme than that if you wanted to slowly control everything and make it look beautifully fluent. We're interested in automating this a little bit more. And there are ways that you can do that, okay? If you automate the process a little bit, you've got a system called a scripting system. So the idea here is you build up a dictionary of individual words. So you have, for each dictionary item, you know the motion it has, and you know which word it is. And then if somebody wants to build a new sentence, they don't have to build every movement by hand. Instead, they draw upon items from that dictionary and assemble a whole sentence. There's even some commercial tools out there, although they have a lot of limitations with small dictionaries or limits in how many facial expressions they have. If you want to automate it some more, you'd have a system that is called an automatic generation system, or maybe a machine translation system. This might be a situation where software tries to automatically plan the sentence. So for example, tools that would automatically translate from English to ASL. There are some folks out there studying this topic, although it's pretty far off. Folks have not been studying translation between English and ASL automatically as long as they have been for other languages in the world. And if you've played around with Google Translate, you'd see sort of the state of the art of this. In either case, the stuff that we build in my laboratory would be useful, because whether a computer's planning it automatically or whether a human plans it, in both of these situations, you've got a script of the sentence, a sequence of words all in a row, and you need to create a whole animation. So our lab creates the software that goes from that plan to the final output. So it's got to plan all the movements to make it look natural and clear. And it's hard. So maybe some of this was suggested by the example I gave you, that you've got to time all the facial expressions, the movements in between words need to be right. If the timing isn't quite perfect, people's comprehension scores dip down. So there's a lot of factors you have to get just right during the synthesis process so that the output is clear. And we know this because we've done experiments on it. We've done a lot of studies at our lab to change many of these variables and to see how much error people will tolerate if some aspect of the animation is wrong. So the big picture, we want to make technology which will go from some kind of script about what we want the character to say, and it'll actually plan a whole movement. I'll replay him because I was talking. I'll start in a minute. And our system has to make a lot of choices as it does this in terms of timing things, coordinating elements of the movement, smoothing motions between elements, these kind of things. Any questions so far? Yeah?
Is there any special grammar that it tracks and will recognize the words, like by creating this animation? Like under what basis how this animation is created, like hand movements, finger movements?
I didn't fully understand, I'm sorry.
Like he's trying to do something, right? He's trying to say something through finger movements and also hand gestures. Under what basis, like how does it interpret the words, the sentence?
Well, in this case, we are not going from motion to script. We're going from script to motion. So for our job, we're going to take this here, and we're trying to convert it into the animation.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, parts of that we are controlling include the finger positions, the hand shape. There's a lot of factors. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I get it.
Okay. So the way we try to approach this at our lab is we use a lot of data from people to underlie how the character moves. We don't just play recordings of people, though. Instead, we make a lot of recordings of people in a large collection using motion capture technology. And then we statistically analyze patterns in the movements, okay? So we're not trying to just build individual words. Instead, we're trying to build models that explain the flow from one word to another, or might predict the timing from one word to the next. So then with this, we build equations of our animation software, and then we can create examples that we might want to show people. Now here's where the experimental element comes in. So we might think we have a model which is the right way of doing things, but we don't know. Or we might have a few ones we're trying to compare. So we can set up a study with actual participants, determine which one is the winner and which one's doing best, and then repeat and iterate and keep trying to refine that model. And so this is where the design cycle comes back into the picture. Okay, so as promised, so this talk is going to be this case study of a study that we did, and I'll try to show you a little bit behind the scenes of the methodologies that were important to worry about. So in this case, we had created some models that predicted elements of how the face should move to perform some of those facial expressions I showed you at the beginning, like the topic one or the question face. And what we were interested in is whether or not people would actually perceive the animations and recognize that those linguistic elements were there. So to do this, we actually created a test bank of experimental stimuli. We invented American Sign Language sentences that required certain facial expressions in them. And we created a standard test set that we shared with the research community. And we not only made the plan of the sentences, we also created comprehension questions that you could ask people, and it would measure whether or not they interpreted the facial expression correctly. So in this particular study, we had 28 experimental stimuli. So these were different sentences that might have different types of facial expressions in them. And each participant in the study saw all 28, but no one saw the same story twice, and the stories were presented in random order. And I'll show you in a moment, we showed different versions of animation. Some with facial expressions, some without, as basis of comparison. So in the study, people would see an animation, and we'll actually see a picture in a minute of what people saw during the experiment. But what did we ask them afterward? Well, we asked several kinds of questions. We had some Likert scale questions, so some numerical scale questions about the overall impression they had of the quality of the animation. We also asked those comprehension questions that I mentioned to see if they understood the meaning. And these tasks were actually difficult because they didn't know the questions in advance, and they only got to watch the sentence one time. So they didn't know what it was they had to look for. I mentioned there were 3 different kinds of things that people saw. So in this particular study, we had our new model. We had created facial expressions. As a lower baseline, we had animations that had no facial expression. So kind of the state of the art before we built these models. As a top line or an upper baseline in this study, we had videos of a human signer performing these sentences as well. The idea here is, if you were to just show your own animations, you'll ask questions and you'll get some kind of score, but what does it mean? I mean, what does it mean if people circled a 4 on a 1 to 10 scale, right? If you have nothing to compare it to, how do you know how you're doing? So in this case, we can compare to humans, or we can compare to what the state of the art of technology was before we built the thing we built, and in that way we can see what we did to improve. So when people came in for the study, they first got a video from a native signer who was going to be presenting the explanation of the instructions for the study. So I'll play a little bit of this and see what he says. So now you're going to see some different stories. There's going to be a signer. The signer's name is Charlie. That signer's name, it's always Charlie. It doesn't matter what the signer looks like. So sometimes it's going to be a video of a real person. Sometimes it's going to be a computer character. Doesn't matter. Either way, that signer's name is Charlie. After we see the story, I'm going to come back and I'll ask you some comprehension questions. So then the person would actually see one of the stimuli. So yesterday, I met Bob. Is that your manager? Do you like him? People would then be asked some Likert scale questions about whether they understood, or actually questions about the quality that they perceived. So these were also explained to people in the form of American Sign Language first. And then they were asked comprehension questions about the information that was in the original story. Okay? And these were once again shown as ASL questions, as videos they'd watch. And for each one, they would answer it on a scale of definitely yes to definitely no, and they could answer not sure, maybe in the middle if they weren't sure. So we'll see one of these. So in this case, he's asking, did Charlie just ask you a question? So one of the facial expressions we were trying to study was the asking a question facial expression. And so if you had noticed that in the animation, you would have realized that at the end, the character was asking you if you liked Bob. At the end of the study, after they'd seen all 28 examples, we had another round of testing where people saw things side by side, and they answered some comparative questions about the quality of the animations they saw. So in this case, they would have 3 versions of the same sentence, but in different forms. So it would either be the human, an animation with a facial expression, or one without. And then they were asked to report the quality level of each of these. All right, so some results from this study. In this case, we evaluated our subjective scores. So those were the 1 to 10 scale questions of whether it looked grammatical, whether it was easy to understand, or whether it moved in a natural manner. And we also had the comprehension question scores. And we had the 3 cases. Those are illustrated by 3 different levels of shading in this graph here, where the dark bar is the video of the human, the stripes would be the one with facial expression, and the one without facial expression is the lighter color. So in this case, we found some statistical difference between the upper baseline and everything else. But using subjective scores, we actually weren't able to measure any differences between having the face or not. Doesn't look too good for our model. Over here with the comprehension question scores, we did find statistical differences between all 3 cases. So it did improve understandability as measured by the questions in this case. We also did the side-by-side testing, and we got the overall quality scores that people had from these. And once again, we did have significant differences between all 3 cases in the study. Okay, so in this case, I took you on a quick tour through the experiment, but I didn't do some things I would have done if I had been presenting this at a conference. Okay? I didn't really present what the models were. I didn't talk about what we built. I didn't really explain what the state of the art was before I did this, or what the state of the art is now. In this case, I just wanted you to see the mechanics of the study, but those are things I would have done if this had been a different setting. Because here, we're just kind of studying how did we actually do the mechanics of the study. All right, so how would you actually successfully advertise for a study if you're looking for participants with a particular kind of ability level? Well, the internet is a big help. So for this particular study, we wound up using email distribution lists. So in particular, when you're advertising to the deaf community, there does tend to be more community level organization that you can tap into. So there's Facebook groups, there's usually email newsletter distribution lists in different geographic areas. This study that I'm presenting here, we conducted in New York City before my lab moved to RIT. And so we didn't have the luxury of a campus with over 1,000 deaf and hard of hearing students on it. We had to go find people around the city. We also made a lot of contacts over the years with local schools, many of which had sort of community centers, and we advertised to them. We also had a lot of members of our research team who were deaf, who had personal connections with the local deaf community. So you see different methods of recruitment here. So there's electronic blast sort of things, there's relationship building over time, and you've also got sort of personal contacts with the community. Okay. It's also important to use methods of contact that people who have a certain disability would actually use. So email and texting tends to be very popular among people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And so we made sure that we had mobile phone numbers available where people could ask us questions if they were interested in the study. The email address that we had was something that would immediately send an alert to a phone so that we could reply instantly if somebody had questions. You also want to make sure that you're recruiting who you think you're recruiting. Okay? So in particular, if you're focused on trying to find people who are deaf or hard of hearing, you want to define very specifically who you mean. Do you mean a certain level of hearing ability that the person might have? Or do you mean a certain level of language skill? And those might be independent things. In this study, we needed people to make pretty sophisticated judgments about the quality level of something that was sign language. So we needed native signers. We needed people who grew up signing their whole life. So in this case, it's not good enough to just find people who can sign somewhat. You actually need to know a little bit more about their story. You need to know when they started signing. So this means an ideal participant for us is somebody who actually started signing in childhood, or grew up in a household with some signing, or maybe went to a school at a really young age where they started to use sign language. And that's a minority of the deaf community. So we were filtering within a smaller group. So if you don't screen properly, you're going to get judges who are not going to be sufficiently critical of your system. So maybe that's good in some sense. You think that you're going to get higher scores in your study, but you know, people will notice if you didn't actually screen properly for subjects. Now there's good and bad ways to do this, of course. You might just ask, do you sign really well, or is signing your first language? The challenge here is the use of sign language is a real marker of identity as membership in the deaf community. And so people might answer that question based on their feelings of attachment to the community, not necessarily based on a frank assessment of their language skills. Also, especially if you're a hearing researcher, asking someone who's deaf whether they're really a good signer can actually be kind of offensive. It looks like you're challenging their status in the deaf community in some way. Okay? So you really kind of need to know where you're coming from and where the potential participant is coming from and be sensitive to that during screening. So in this case, we screened using some questions that just sort of asked about life history that would be typical of someone who would be a participant in the study. So, did you grow up using ASL as a child? Did your parents use ASL at home? More factual questions. There's logistical things you got to worry about too. People actually have to get there to your study. So especially if you were conducting a study with a group of users that might have a disability that affects their mobility or travel, you have to really think carefully about, do you really need them to come all the way to your campus or your site? Or can you make your study mobile? Okay. At our lab, we always try to have a version of our experiments that can be kind of packaged up to go. So we try to package up laptops that have all of our stimuli and materials on it so that we can host people at the laboratory doing the study, but if we need to get 50 participants in a week, we need to go out there with laptops and meet people places in order to get all that data so quickly. Especially when we were in New York City, you might think it is a lot of people there, but there's also a lot of traffic and a lot of slow subway riding and transfers to buses, so people may not be willing to travel to your site. Okay. Now, the equation here has changed a little bit for our lab now at RIT because of so many deaf and hard of hearing students right on the campus. But you would be surprised how much it helps if you can go and meet somebody over on their side of campus or something like this. It does help with recruitment. If you've ever recruited people for a study, you may also know that using just 9 to 5 business hours does not always work if you're trying to get participants, okay? You might need to have some evening or weekend hours because people have school, they have jobs. And so you're just going to put another barrier in your recruitment of participants unless you have broad hours. You also want to make sure that people can find your study and stuff like this. So having some advertisements or directional arrows or things like this to help people find the place can be handy. Now for any HCI study that you do, it's of course good to make sure it works before you bring people into your lab to try it, okay? But especially if you're trying to recruit for people that have a very specific demographic criteria, you don't want to exhaust your participant pool and have an experiment that has a flaw in it or some problem that's a technical challenge, okay? So the need for having a pilot study to get all the kinks out of your experiment in advance is even more important, all right? At our lab, we tend to do about 2 pilot studies before we ever do a full experiment. And we usually try to recruit somebody whose data we're not going to use in the final study, but it's somebody who might be kind of willing to put up with a few problems. So it might be someone who's been a participant in a few studies already and has seen things go well, and therefore they know that if we have a problem sometime, it's just a fluke. We've usually been pretty good when we've had participants come in. Questions about this?
So in the pilot studies, how many people do you?
I mean, historically, we tend to have 2 people come in and try it as a dry run, but we'll have even more than that that will just sort of run internally. We'll have people pretend to be participants for each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how many in a full experiment?
A full experiment, it depends. On the smallest scale, we might have 12. On the biggest scale, we might have 50 in a lot of our past studies.
Fine. Okay.
Yep.
In this case, what have you learned from the pilot study?
A lot of times, it's sort of logistical problems. So usually with the pilot study, you're not trying to learn a scientific answer. You're just trying to make sure that your study works. So, for example, if you're going to show people 28 stories, and on screen, you're going to have questions specific to each story that are shown afterward, one minor bug in your code that generated your stimuli, and you'll get the wrong questions after the wrong story, and nothing will make sense, right? And especially if you're going to put stuff on laptops and send people out there to go conduct data, you don't want to learn that after you've already sent people out with the laptops. Those kind of challenges. Another big one, you want to know how long it's going to take, right? So you think you've got a 70-minute study or a 60-minute study. That's what the IRB on your campus approved. That's what your advertising materials say. You want to make sure it's actually possible to finish. I mentioned IRB. So if you're doing research at a university setting, you're going to have your protocol approved by the Institutional Review Board. Part of this typically is that you're going to collect informed consent from the participant before they actually participate in your study. So this usually is a paper form, and they would read information about what's going to happen during the experiment. Sometimes they need to sign it, and you keep it for your records. At our lab, we always have a native signer, or at least a very skilled signer in a few cases, be the one that conducts the study. So it's normally deaf researchers conducting experiments with deaf participants at our lab. In a few cases, we might use an interpreter or a non-native signer, but that's pretty rare. So we usually present materials as English, but the person explains it in ASL. We have not experimented before with video consent at our lab. There are researchers who are looking into this. It makes your IRB process a little more challenging because you do want to make sure you have an equivalent message in both languages. Also, not everyone's ASL skills are exactly the same, so we've usually found it better to use an interpreter, but we usually use paper forms. Do you have a question?
The participant is evaluating, in the one task that you showed, they're evaluating using a Likert. Is there a possibility of a video Likert, or is the English in that Likert question sufficiently approachable that anybody can answer?
So the questions that we normally show will first explain in American Sign Language, and then the text for the Likert questions is usually pretty telegraphic. So it's just enough to remind people that 10 is good or 1 is bad, and the question's like grammar question mark or something like this, so that we don't have a ton of English syntax structure shown there. And that's intentional. So it's meant to be a reminder question and a reminder scale. Another thing that can certainly help with recruitment is the level of compensation you offer in the study. I mean, you're using people's time, right? So sometimes you can get volunteers, but it's nice to compensate people for their time. In our studies, we also will tend to pay cash. In particular, if you're thinking about studies with people with disabilities, I know it can be common to hand out gift cards or things like this, or some kind of raffle ticket or something like this for a study. You've got to make sure that that's appropriate to the group of people that you're sending stuff for. So you want to make sure that you aren't recruiting a disability group of people that maybe that kind of gift card isn't appropriate. So usually we just use cash for studies at our lab. We usually compensate people at a rate of $25 to $40 for a 1-hour study, which is kind of high. But remember, we're recruiting for a specific group of people within a specific group of people. So you have to balance the amount of time we would spend trying to find people compared to a couple dollars difference for compensation in the study. And we've kind of decided that a higher level of compensation overall saves resources for the whole cost of the experiment. It's also important that the environment is comfortable when the person's participating, okay? So for any group of people with disabilities, you do want to make sure that the lab environment is accessible, okay? If you've got paper experiment materials, but you're recruiting someone with low vision, maybe you want to have electronic materials so people can see it on a screen or enlarge it. In our case, we're focused on people who are ASL signers, but there's something we had to be sensitive about, and that is American Sign Language exists primarily in areas of the planet that speak English. And so ASL always is situated in this context with English as another language located in the same place. And this means that there are many signers who are pretty skilled at code switching between something that's more full ASL grammar and something that's this ASL English grammar hybrid, especially if they're trying to communicate someone that has poor ASL skills, okay, like a beginning signer. People will just change. They'll stop signing ASL, they'll start signing some sort of Englishy thing. In addition, there's a lot of people who are deaf who've experienced either education or medical or clinical settings where a value system was communicated, where signing was positioned as lower status to the use of English in speech. And so if you have an experimental environment that has sort of a clinical, laboratory, or medical kind of vibe to it, it might bring up these feelings in participants, and they might start to code switch to something more Englishy. So this is bad if you want to get people to give you critical judgments about ASL. It's also bad if you were going to record them, which we do in some other projects. So we try to avoid having the lab environment look like a doctor's office. We try to avoid it looking like a mysterious science laboratory. We also try to surround people with other fluent native signers so that they're naturally engaging in conversation. Questions? All right, so let's talk about what you're going to show people. I mentioned that we invented some stimuli. We invented some sample sentences and sample questions. We actually did some experiments about what's the right way to do that, okay? So we tried inventing stimuli a few different ways, and then we measured which way of doing it was better. One thing you could imagine is you could start from an English sentence. There do exist a lot of English test sentences out there for different linguistic experiments. You can imagine adapting some of them in some way or translating them into ASL and then using that as a basis for your stimuli, okay? The other approach is you start from ASL from the get-go and you author all of your materials and all your questions in ASL, And then if you need it to be useful for other purposes, you can translate some of it into English so it's easier for people to use. We tried a head-to-head comparison of these two approaches. And as you might imagine, it tends to work better if you start in the ASL, because if you translate from English, you wind up getting stimuli materials that incorporate English grammar in some ways, and they don't work as well in studies. And so we tested this. We created stimuli that were based with and without facial expression, and we created some that were started in English and translated to ASL, and some that were in ASL the whole time. And we did head-to-head comparisons between versions that had facial expression and some that did not. Okay? So, what would a good result here be? A good result would be that you would be able to see statistical differences here between with and without facial expression. Because that means you've got stimuli material that are actually working. They're helping you reveal a difference between when the facial expressions are there or not. In this version here, we weren't able to measure a difference between when facial expression was in our stimuli or not. That's a problem. It probably means that these were not quite grammatical stimuli or something about the English was influencing them in some way. We've also done some studies at our lab to try different ways that you could have your upper or your lower baseline in a study, and what's the right way to do it. In the example I showed you at the beginning, it looked kind of like this. We had two versions of animation that we were testing out, and then the third condition we compared it to was a video of a real human. Okay? And that is one way that you could do things. The problem is there wasn't really a standard in the field. Okay? Some research groups out in the world were using video of people as their upper baseline. Other research groups in the world were using an animation as the upper baseline. So they would have an animator create very slowly a very high quality animation that had everything just right, but it was still an animation. And they would use that as their top line in a study. So you had research results being published, some with an upper baseline of an animation, and some with an upper baseline of a video. Okay? We were curious, does that make any difference? So we conducted a study 2 different ways. We did one, the bottom 2 cases were completely identical in both studies. In one study, though, the upper baseline we used was an animation. In the other study, the upper baseline we used was a video of a human. But all of these other stimuli in the other cases were totally identical. So really, you shouldn't expect any differences in the scores for them, but we did. So these graphs are a lot going on. So let me explain what's going on with these. In these graphs here, the purple bars, that are usually the ones on top, are from the study where the upper baseline was an animation. Okay. The green ones are from a study where the upper baseline was a video of a real human. Okay. The ones that are labeled upper, they're actually different. So in the one case, it was an animation. In the other case, it was a video. These other bars for the model in the lower, this is all the animations that we showed that was our actual models we were testing. Okay? What's interesting is these were completely identical in both studies. So you would expect that the bars ought to look the same. Okay? That's not quite what we found. First of all, as you might expect, if you use a video of a real human as an upper baseline, well, people like videos of real humans a lot. Okay? They think they look pretty realistic. They tended to get higher scores than upper baselines that were a beautiful animation, but it's still an animation. Okay? So at one level, if you were going to compare a paper that somebody published that had an upper baseline of a video to another paper that somebody published with an upper baseline of an animation, it's not a totally fair comparison because videos are always going to get higher scores. So if you're comparing people relative to that top line in their study, it's always going to seem more strategic for a researcher to use an animation as an upper baseline because you're going to be able to get closer to it. But there was another interesting effect. And this is something we noticed in particular when we looked at the subjective scores that people answered on 1 to 10 scales. What we found was, if somebody participates in an experiment and everything they see is an animation, even the upper baseline, they'll give some scores to all of your animations, right? If they participate in a study where some of the things are videos of real people, well, that raises the bar. Now suddenly they're extra critical when they look at the animations, and they give those animations lower subjective scores because in the same study, they were also exposed to real videos of people, okay? So this means that if you look at a published result and one paper had a video upper baseline, another had an animation upper baseline, that's pretty important because when you show a video of a person, it's going to depress any of the subjective scores, okay? So that lesson's very particular to American Sign Language. If you're not doing experiments on that, what is the takeaway? The baselines you compare to matter quite a lot. And the quality of that upper baseline that you might show as a basis for comparison, it's not just a score inherent to itself. People have a comparative sense when they participate in the study, and it may affect and depress subjective judgments about other things. Okay, we've got a couple minutes. I'll finish up quick, and then we'll have a little time for questions. One other technique we have explored at the lab for doing evaluations is using eye tracking. So we've done studies to evaluate where do people look when they see a video of a person, where do people look when they see a good animation, where do they look when they see a bad animation, okay? And we found interesting patterns. So when people are looking at videos of real people, or beautiful animations that are very high quality in the precision of the movements, people look at the mouth, actually. And they really kind of stay there at the mouth. And that's what native signers do when they watch other human signers. Okay, everything else is peripheral vision. If you start showing somebody lower quality, they start to look up and down between the mouth and the hands. They try to look at other things because they're struggling to understand the video. Well, this is interesting as a diagnostic tool. This means you can show somebody an animation stimulus and measure what their eyes are doing. Don't even have to ask them any questions. And you can use that metric to evaluate the quality of your stimulus, okay? So this means you don't have to go through all the effort of engineering questions specific to the things you're going to show. You might just be able to get some eye data like this from people and be able to evaluate the quality. Of course, getting good quality eye data is its own challenge. There's lots of logistical problems with it sometimes. So it's not necessarily an easy answer. So our lab's done a lot of work on how to best conduct studies. We've also published papers on how to incorporate people with disabilities into the research process. We've done a lot of experiments to see what linguistic aspects of sign language are important for a good quality result. And then based on some of those experiments, we've actually tried to build models of some of those things and see if we can actually automate them in a system that generates an animation. So, if folks are looking for capstone opportunities or things like this, there are some things we're looking for. Certainly if you're an American Sign Language signer, please talk to me. But we also have opportunities for folks if they've got strong programming skills, okay? So we have a couple projects that are kind of on a shelf right now at the lab that if somebody wanted to pick up as a capstone opportunity, they could. So for example, if you want to do some work with motion capture technologies or eye tracking, we've got a lot of equipment at the lab. We'd like to explore some of its possibilities. We also have a lot of data recordings of people performing sign language. If you want to dive into a data bank of hundreds of hours of human motion and see if you can learn interesting patterns from it, talk to me. We can create some animations from the models you create, and we can test out if your models are working well. We're also interested in captioning technology. So can you use speech recognition to automatically produce captions? How can you do this effectively, even if they're not perfect? If you have any computer graphics experience, we also are looking for folks to help us use some game engines to create new virtual humans for some signing or other tools. So I'm going to thank the folks that paid for this, and I'd be happy to take a couple questions We only have a couple minutes though before 5 o'clock, but I'd be happy to take a few.
My question is about community sign and colloquialisms and new signs in domains like the sciences, where new signs are emerging all the time. You described the statistical model earlier. How do you reconcile, the 3 or more different signs for birthday? Do you converge on one, or?
So this is a challenge, and it's useful to think about the direction you're talking about. So there are some researchers that focus on the recognition task. Go from a video of a person signing, and let's figure out what they said. In that situation, it's even more critical that you can handle the wide diversity of signs that are out there, because you need to understand anything that comes into your software as a video. From a synthesis perspective, if you're going to go from a script to an output animation, you can get away with just having maybe one version if it's a commonly understood version. Now, if there's a word for birthday that's understood only in one part of the country and not someplace else, then your system's going to need to have multiple items in the dictionary and a principled decision criteria as to why you would use one or the other. We've built dictionary items at our lab. We generally will just try to pick a more standard form. Yeah, it's an interesting problem.
So there's nobody saying this type of ASL is the standard.
I mean, it's a more bottom-up process of a community of people agreeing upon something. Now, certainly there are tests to measure someone's fluency in American Sign Language. There's some standard interviews that people can go through to prove that they're a skilled signer. So there is a right and a wrong way to perform American Sign Language. There is a real grammar, and there is a way that you could be saying something that's linguistically correct or linguistically wrong. But within the world of correct, there can be variations, just like there is in any language. And it could be based on different geographic areas. It could be based on different levels of formality or familiarity that you have. You might change the style of how you're signing. You're still correct, but you're somewhere else inside that space of correct.
So is there any organization or groups that are focusing on correction or verification of ASL skills?
Well, there are a lot of linguistic and educational researchers who investigate ways to create techniques that would evaluate someone fairly to see what their level of skill is. At our lab, we have a project that's starting out that's for ASL students. So we're building some tools using a Kinect, and it would evaluate the motion of an ASL student, and it would give them some feedback whether movements that they're making are typical or not typical of good ASL, right? Our software is not trying to understand every word they say. It's taking a big picture view. Oh, you're making motions that are kind of suspicious here, okay? Because we're not 100% confident that we can understand what they're saying, because that's beyond the state of the art right now. But we can detect if people make motions that are statistically not probable in ASL, and we can give them some feedback on that.
I think at this time we should thank Matt for giving us an overview of that topic area. So on behalf of Sinkai and RIT, thank you.
Sure. Thank you.